Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. And thank you very much to Cheryl for coming to present to us about the alternative paths to the high school diploma. And I know that we're going to have lots of folks watching this recording later on. So welcome to those of you who are watching this at a later date. Cheryl has joined the Parent Training Information Center at the Disability Rights Education Defense Fund in 2007. So almost 20 years, which is thank you so much for your service. There she provides training, support, and technical assistance to children and youth with disabilities, to their families, and to community stakeholders. A primary focus of her work is identifying and removing educational barriers for disabled children and youth and their caregivers, and to educate and empower them to participate and advocate in all educational decision-making. She has special expertise supporting children in foster kinship care and youth in transition to adulthood. So we're particularly thrilled to have her come and present on this topic with us tonight. Cheryl grew up in East Oakland, and her interest in disability and civil rights and education is directly tied to her own experience in her family and community, and the intersection of race, poverty, and disability, and the school to prison pipeline that impacts so many people are particularly things that she cares about and focuses on in her work. Before coming to DREDF, she worked at Stanford University's Center for Biomedical Ethics as a research interviewer on projects exploring the impact of stigma on people with genetic disabilities, for a CDC-funded public health project on autism epidemiology, as a community outreach liaison, and as a program developer and manager for disabled youth in transition program. She holds a bachelor's in social welfare and a master's degree from UC Berkeley. And she has raised her own children with disabilities and is a kinship and foster adoptive parent. So bringing a wealth of experience to us tonight. Go ahead, Cheryl, I'll give you the floor.
All right, let's see if I can get the screen to share correctly again. Are we good?
We're good.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's good to be back in the North Region SELPA and to see so many familiar faces and also to see some new faces. I know this CAC has been working so hard to really, build something that is accessible to families and relevant to families. So I'm really excited to be here. Excuse me. I've been hanging around with the grandkids too much, so I have some sort of strange virus. So if I cough, forgive me. So let's get started. I will stop for questions at the end, but I have no problem at all. Kelly, if you guys want to monitor hands up or, comments, questions and answers, whatever, just let me know.
And Cheryl, are you planning to present for about an hour this evening, or what was your thought on that?
Right? We're talking about an hour. So
Yeah.
hopefully we'll get through the presentation in about 45 minutes.
Okay, great. So then that should give us plenty of time for questions also at the end, but I'll monitor the chat too and chime in if folks post in there.
All right. So I can't do these trainings without telling you a little bit about who we are. DREDF is a national law and policy center focused on the human and civil rights of people with disabilities across a variety of contexts. So transportation, healthcare, policy, high impact litigation. We don't do individual legal representation at DREDF, but we do get involved when there's a systemic issue that's affecting many, many students on a particular issue. And so the Parent Training Information Center at DREDF is one of many of the activities that we do. And let me tell you a little bit about what parent centers are. Back in 1975, when what is now known as IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was being written and passed and going through Congress, the first thing that parents and families and disabled activists said was, it's great to have rights, but this is so complex, how would anyone ever know how to use them? And so because of that intensive lobbying, Congress actually included funding for a parent training and information center that would provide free information, resources, referrals in every state and territory in the U.S. So DREDF has held that grant since 1988. We serve 30 counties in Northern California. There's 3.5 of us, so if we don't get back to you right away, you probably can figure out why. But everything we do is free, and you can call us, and we welcome calls from professionals. We love to talk to educators, to families, and our personal favorite is to talk to the youth themselves. That's always the absolute best thing that can happen. So that's what we do, and we get calls on a variety of subjects, but there's been a lot of interest in tonight's topic, I think, across the state. And my feeling is it's been a long time coming, and it's about darn time. And I'm really glad that this legislation passed with the commitment of really a collaborative group of stakeholders across, our educators, our parents, our youth, professionals, specialists, who realized that we needed to do something about our graduation rates for students with disabilities. So here's the questions I'm hoping we can try to answer tonight. And I will say there's a lot of still open questions because this is a relatively new option. So first of all, let's always remember that there's a purpose to special education and an IEP. And I want to talk about what it is because I think it really guides the decision-making around this new option. We'll talk a little bit about what do we actually mean when we talk about, independence, community, opportunity, inclusion. Why the heck is diploma so important? Because I think for a long time, families were sort of told, not in all cases, but we're often told, that's really not the most important thing here. There's other things we want to focus on for your student. And then let's talk a little bit about what the pathways are to a diploma in California today, because there are actually three, depending on how you frame it, at least three ways that a student who has an IEP can get a high school diploma. And then a certificate of completion is still an option for some students, and we'll talk about that. So here's where I always start. And the reason I start here is that these are the words of IDEA itself. And I think they're incredibly powerful, and they help, I think, all of us remember that the purpose of this legislation was not so that our students with disabilities get to go to school, right? The purpose is to ensure that all students with disabilities, and this is right in the language of IDEA, have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services, and here's the important part, designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for future education, employment, and independent living. And recently, what I've been doing this presentation, I'm now including independent and interdependent, because I think we always assume that independence is the major goal. And there's a lot of cultural variability. There's a lot of individual variability in terms of, is the long-term goal that your child set up in an apartment or an adult group home living independently, or is there more of an interdependent focus? So we should think about that. Okay, so sorry about the text-heavy slide. How do we accomplish this? So first of all, we develop an IEP that is providing meaningful, that's the key word, educational benefit and appropriately ambitious goals. We don't want to, I think this is a concern almost every parent I talk to has, which is, if I agree to a special education evaluation and my child qualifies for an IEP, will they lower their expectations? Or will they provide the remediation and intervention and help they need so that they can, really get as close as possible to meeting the expectations that students without disabilities have? And obviously, this is always an individual decision, but I think it is a concern for a lot of families. Like, don't lower the expectations, but we need to individualize how we're delivering the education based on my child's individual needs. We always want to presume competence. So I talked to an awful lot of families who tell me that they were shocked by the time their child got to high school to realize that they'd actually been off graduation path for a long time. And the parent hadn't really realized it. And that's because they've been often in more segregated settings like special day classes or non-public schools, where maybe the emphasis was more on behavior, emotional regulation, things like that. And the academics really did take a second, were a lower priority in those settings. And even for students who are fully integrated in general education and get some limited pull out services or even push in services, there's always that concern about whether they're really being given the help they need. So if we're going to study ancient Egypt and my student's reading 4 grade levels behind and maybe has an intellectual disability that makes some of the complex language of the textbook very hard, that doesn't mean they can't learn everything about ancient Egypt. And they may get it through videos and through plays and through, alternate ways, but they can still understand some of the key points that we want all students to learn. So we want to presume that students can do this and only lower expectations if it makes sense based on their individual needs to kind of go in a different direction. We know that the large majority of students with an IEP can earn a standard diploma, a regular diploma. We know that in part, interestingly, because, and I can't for sure say this is this year's statistic, I think it's last year's, but about 70% of all students who have an IEP in this country have it under either a specific learning disability or another health impairment. Those were the 2 most common. And those are students who are actually specifically excluded in most cases from what we're going to talk about tonight, this alternative diploma path, because it's assumed that they could earn a regular diploma if they got the right help. So we always want to listen to families, listen to youth. There's a saying that we live by at DREDF, which is nothing about us without us. And certainly this is really important. We're making these decisions about what direction a student should go in terms of diploma options. And we want to make sure there's a pathway to graduation and a high school diploma as a priority for all students. And so, we're always saying special education is not a place, right? It's a package of supports and services that we bring to a student in their least restrictive educational environment. And I think of an IEP really as a toolkit. It's a set of tools we can use so that we can meet the student where they are and help them close gaps in terms of where they need help. But it's also always supposed to be a strengths-based process. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Why do we care so much about the diploma issue, especially for students that we're going to talk about tonight, the students who have significant cognitive disabilities, which is about, give or take, about 10% of students who have an IEP. First of all, the research is pretty clear, and the working group that got together that helped make this new law happen really did a great job of identifying these issues. It's a hit to the confidence and self-esteem of many students when they aren't on a diploma track. Sometimes they're told things like, you get to walk with the others, even though you don't have a diploma, as if it's some sort of favor. Students want to feel like they went on their educational journey and they worked hard and made significant progress toward our California state standards. We also know that sometimes, not always, but sometimes being not on a diploma track it makes it easier to talk about segregated settings because you're not focusing on the state standards anymore, not to the same degree. Often, you're working with behavioral goals, emotional goals, functional life goals, and so on. And we know, and the research is really pretty clear, that the more students have an opportunity to interact with a diversity of other students, everyone does better. And there's obviously lots of exceptions to that. But one of my favorite things to emphasize in our regular basics training at DREDF is that we want students to be held to a high standard, and we want them to be prepared for the world they're going to live in. And in the world they're going to live in, there are no special day classes. There are no real segregated settings. We've worked really hard to make sure that institutions and so on are either completely eliminated or absolute last options. The other thing is that students who don't have a diploma are at a real disadvantage in terms of employment. And it's stark. So we know 90% of employers prefer, if they're trying to choose between a few applicants, they'll choose the student with a diploma first. We know that about 2/3 of jobs require a diploma or sometimes a GED. and prefer some college or post-high school training. We know that most colleges and training programs require a diploma or a GED. There's exceptions, but most of them will look for that. Students who don't have a diploma may not qualify for some types of financial aid for college or have a delay in when they can get that financial aid. And they may not meet minimum qualifications for college applications, joining the military, job training programs, and so on. So there's a real impact. Just to get the depressing statistics out of the way, and I want to watch my time carefully. So in California in 2022, I should have pulled up 2023, but I didn't have time. While about 87% of students graduated with a diploma, which is a big improvement, students with disabilities were much lower. And that's actually, that statistic there is, I think, a little bit of a fluke. Usually I see rates at around 70%. So there's a big difference between students in all categories and students who have a disability. They're one of the worst outcome groups. So Native American students, African American students, students with disabilities. And of course, we all know that no one lives in just one category. So you have to think about the fact that, we have a variety of intersections here where if the student has a disability and is in other high-risk groups, things are even more scary. Dropout rates for students with disabilities in 2022 were around 14%. We know that's a vast underestimation because many families will get so fed up or students will be having so much trouble that they will decide to homeschool or just let their students leave school without necessarily reporting it. So it's at least that high. Employment rates are much lower. So if you look at in the age group 20 to 24, about 50% of students with disabilities were employed versus 72% of students without a disability in that age range. And, college attendance and so on are all areas where this lack of a diploma can really come into play. And so, as I said, the California Alternative Diploma Pathways to a High School Diploma Work Group, it's a mouthful, but it's a bunch of various people and experts and families and youth really working together to try to figure out what do we do about this, the fact that the minute it gets hard for a lot of students, we sort of move them quickly to a certificate of completion track here in California. And while that can sometimes be an appropriate decision, the reality is it was being used a lot for students who had mental health issues and we don't want to stress them, partly because they could then stay in a transition program until age 22. So once you graduate with a regular diploma, it's actually a change of placement. That's the legal language. The student is now no longer eligible for an IEP or public school, high school services anymore. The diploma is the event that constitutes a change of placement. So a lot of families felt like I'd rather get a certificate of completion because I know my student isn't going to be ready to graduate at 18, or I know my student needs to emphasize other things. And so the graduation rates for students with disabilities were significantly less. And there was a lot of sort of built-in incentive to move students off diploma path. So creating a new pathway for students with significant cognitive disabilities was very important as a priority when the group looked back on all their research and all their input. And in California, there wasn't really a pathway to any kind of alternative diploma. And so they came up with some recommendations and it got put into law and we're off to the races. And we'll talk a little bit more about it. But before I get into the details of it, I want to make sure to say that we still expect the majority of students with disabilities and special education to receive a regular high school diploma. That is where we start. That should be the expectation, whether the students in kindergarten with Down syndrome or whether the students in middle school with significant emotional challenges or whether the student is in high school and really credit deficient and struggling. We want to try to find a way for that student to access the same learning as other students, even if it's in a different way. So that's the majority of students. And then there are some students who have moderate support needs. They would not be eligible for this alternative diploma path we're going to talk about tonight. But there's actually a lot more, and the working group noted this, a lot more we could do to support graduation for students with more moderate needs. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But for example, many students don't end up graduating because they can't pass Algebra 1. It's very hard to get a waiver for Algebra 1, but it can be done. And we've seen it done. It's just a very long bureaucratic process, and the student has to really show that they've tried to pass it for a while, and they no matter, even if they couldn't, they've been trying, and so they can get a waiver. There are also ways to have students graduate not with our school district's graduation requirements, which are usually above and beyond what the state requires. The state sets minimum graduation requirements, but most of our school districts and charter schools add to that and have additional requirements and so on. So an IEP team and a local district can make a decision that it may be more appropriate for a student to meet minimum graduation requirements, but they're still earning a regular high school diploma. And then finally, there's the group of students, as I said, about 10%, more or less, of students who have significant cognitive disabilities. And so this new law creates an alternative pathway that's tied to alternative state standards and assessments. So just to hop back for a minute to that other group, that moderate group who doesn't really fall into this 10% category, I just don't want to leave you all with the idea that if your student, for whatever reason, and these are IEP team decisions in most cases, doesn't qualify for this alternative pathway to a diploma, that does not mean it's either one or the other. So that moderate group, the CDE's website, I included the link right here. It specifically says that the student can get a diploma through alternative means to complete their graduation requirements. So there's all kinds of ways that we can be flexible and think about what the student needs and individualize their education. It's just really hard. I think in a time when we're so short-staffed, when everyone is so stressed and overworked, where there's a real lack of awareness and training about what could we do to help that student? What do you mean by an independent study for the student or interdisciplinary study? I just don't want to leave you with the idea that an IEP team can't sit down at the table together and say, okay, let's think outside the box for this student. They don't have a significant cognitive disability. They're not going to be eligible for this alternative path. But at this point in time, without some more support and creative outside the box thinking, they're probably not going to earn a diploma, and we don't want to lose that group either. And again, as I said, the Algebra 1 dilemma is one of the big barriers in our state, and their students can get a waiver for it, but it's very hard, and it requires often at least a couple of years of trying to pass the class. I have seen some districts do things like offer Algebra 1 as a 4-year course. Super slow. Take your time. Don't rush it, with the goal that we'll start maybe in 8th or 9th grade and very slowly and carefully build up that knowledge base. And the student, eventually has met all the requirements. Okay, and I wanted to make sure you understood some of the accommodations that can help with the diploma. That's not the focus tonight, but I included them because I think part of what we see happen a lot is that IEP teams will include common accommodations like reduced homework, preferential seating, maybe some sensory tools that students can use, etc. Assistive technology is a big one. But then the student doesn't use their accommodations. And we'll hear things like, well, they have them, but she doesn't use her preferred seating, or she doesn't want to get notes or whatever. And so in those situations, I just want to remind everyone that one of the things we don't do a very good job of, and we need to do a better job of, is teaching students about their disability, teaching students self-advocacy, helping them understand why these accommodations aren't given to them out of pity or, as some kind of special favor or some indication that they're less than, but that they accommodate their need to learn differently. and sort of take away some of the stigma and shame that a lot of students tell us, I'm not going to that resource room. Everybody knows that's the special room, and so on. So let's get into the meat of the alternate pathway to a diploma. How does it work? So CDE defines a significant cognitive disability, and I'm quoting from them, as a disability or multiple disabilities that significantly impact intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior, essential for a person to live independently and function safely in daily life. They make it clear that it's not an IQ score. We're not going to make these decisions because Johnny has an IQ of 60 and Sally has a 72, so Sally's not eligible because the cutoff's 70 or something like that. That's not how these decisions are being made. It's also really important here in California because we actually don't do IQ testing on Black and Brown students in most cases. And so, we need to use a more holistic understanding of who the student is and what they need. So really, they need to be eligible to take California's alternative assessments. And I included here, in case you love technology and want to get into the details, the decision-making tool that's supposed to be used when thinking about whether a student should be eligible to take alternate or alternative assessments here in California. These were still state standards aligned assessments, but they are, they have expectations that are different. They can be administered in different ways, and they may be taking the student kind of where they are with their reading or math level, but they're still tied to those state standards. Whoops, hold on. I have very sensitive trackpad and my mouse is out of batteries. Okay, and so let me just do this. Hold on. Okay, hold on. I'm frozen for a second. Let me see if I can just find another way around this. There we go. All right. So, part of why this work was so important is that the certificate of completion option, as I said earlier, was leading to sometimes to some unintended consequences. If the student was really credit deficient, or the family really wanted to make sure that they could stay in special education until they were after 18 in a transition program, there was kind of an incentive built in to work toward a certificate instead. I've seen it a lot in programs for students with emotional challenges and mental health needs. Students who don't have any kind of significant intellectual or cognitive disability, but end up on a certificate track because the idea is that it's just too much for them to be pressured around academics. That's not our priority. Let's work on these other issues for them. There are no student performance expectations related to a certificate of completion. It really doesn't have much value at all in post-school environments. So, when you say, oh, well, no, I don't have a diploma, but I got a certificate of completion, people either don't know what that means or they assume that, there was some reason why you weren't capable. There's a need to define what the certificate is, and different districts do a better or worse job at it, and to set expectations and to have some sort of standardization about what a certificate of completion is. But it's sometimes used instead of providing the student with more intensive services or supports. And again, it goes back to that problem of, that concern that we're lowering expectations rather than, really holding the student to the state standards, but maybe in a different way. So the new pathway, and I stole this slide from Undivided, which is a great website, and I have this resource at the end of the presentation too. It's designed for students, again, who meet this definition of a significant cognitive disability. So already you could probably anticipate that there might be some disagreement on IEP teams about whether that is the student or not. And so some of those basic advocacy strategies, calling an IEP meeting, discussing it, getting evaluations, thinking about maybe getting an independent evaluation if there's disagreement about it, asking your district to provide you with prior written notice, putting in writing why they think your student does or does not fit this definition, are all going to be important advocacy tools. It's considered equivalent to a traditional high school diploma. And this is one of the big important things. Nobody's going to see a student's diploma and know that it was achieved through an alternative pathway. And so that was a big part of it. So no matter what the student wants to do, when they're asked, did you get a diploma, they can show their diploma, and there's no way that it's coded. It might be, the transcript might have some hints, and there might be other hints, just like there are now for students who maybe want to go to Stanford or UC Berkeley, and their IEP might have that they went to the resource classroom and parents worry. Does that signal that they were a special education student? And so people are going to think they're less capable. But here with this new option, the diploma itself is a regular high school diploma for the outside world purposes. It's meant for students who take the California alternate assessment. And it holds students to state standards, but through these alternate assessments. It requires students to meet the statewide minimum coursework, but it exempts them from any of the extras that the district might want to tack on. Now, there may well be situations, because as this all unfolds, we're going to see how it happens, where a student says, but I want to take additional classes. I want to be challenged. And even though, I don't have to with this new pathway, can I? And I think the answer is probably yes, but just to be clear, they don't have to. And this is the important thing. It is not a change of placement to get the alternate diploma. And why that's important is students can still stay in special ed here in California until they're 22. So it's always been true, even though practically it's never been really implemented correctly. It's always been true that a student can stay in special education after high school and still work on their diploma. But many, many families over the years, and many educators too, have said, no, if you don't get a regular diploma by the time you're like 18 or 19, maybe you can have an extra year. But if you haven't done it by then you go into a transition program, which is an alternative to a diploma. We're working on functional life skills. And that's never been true, because there's an I in IEP. And if it's the student's goal to keep working on their diploma, they've always been able to keep working on their diploma. I know, in fact, in Albany, for example, a few years back, there were a couple of students who were going to community college classes to still work on some of their graduation requirements, but they were in the transition program to also work on things like navigating the environment and independent living skills and functional life skills and so on. So this idea that students just fall into one easy and well-defined box is just something we always need to fight against. But I think that's a big reason to consider this option, because you're not saying to a family, gee, sorry, your student got this new diploma that's tied to these alternative assessments, but it's a regular diploma, bye-bye. That's not how it will work. It's not a change of placement. They can keep working on their transition goals and participate in their transition program. The transcript will probably hint at the fact that they got an alternate diploma or took alternate assessments, but every district's going to have to figure that out. But just understand that it is not an either or situation. A student can take this diploma or stay on a regular diploma path and be in the transition program too. It's never been one or the other. One change that I just became aware of in doing the research for tonight's presentation is that just this past June, they amended the law that created this new alternative pathway, because I remember last year when I was doing presentations, so many families were devastated because it was only going to apply to students who entered ninth grade 2022, 23 or later. So there were all these students, who entered high school before then, but hadn't still, maybe they were even in a transition program. They were, and they really wanted to take advantage of this. And we were all telling them, nope, the rule is you have to enter. But they amended the ed code to say that a local education agency, which is a fancy way of saying school district or charter school, can exempt an individual who doesn't meet that criteria. But it's kind of a case-by-case decision. I just want to make sure that you all know that you don't have to just roll over. If you really think that the student, should be considered for this. Now they're a senior, and they're going to go into the transition program, but you want them on an alternative pathway. It's worth a discussion. Part of the problem is, though, that in order to be eligible for this new pathway, you had to be eligible to take these alternative assessments in the 11th grade. And so this is where things get a little bit, I think, confusing for families, for schools, because the law doesn't require that your student takes the alternative assessments, right? We can all waive our kids out of state testing. Here in California, we get to do that. And a lot of families do that. A lot of students say, I don't want to, take these tests. So it isn't that the student has to take the California alternative assessment in the 11th grade, but the team has to document. Sorry about the typo there, guys. It's not division. This is a decision. But the team has to document that if they were to take state tests, this is the state test they would take. Interestingly, the law doesn't require IEP teams to notify a student's parent about whether or not their child's going to be eligible for an alternative diploma before 10th grade. So it's not a requirement. Nevertheless, I haven't talked to a school district yet that doesn't say, of course, it's best practice to have an IEP meeting and discuss this issue, certainly in 9th grade, for students who might be eligible for this alternate diploma. And this is why, and Katie and I decided we're going to do a training just on this topic down the road, that the fact that California has clarified that you can have an IEP transition plan much earlier than 16, and certainly something you should be thinking about by the first year of high school or sooner. But the part of the reason for that is that we all want to be on the same page making these decisions, because if the student's going to stay on a diploma path, we want to make sure that we're thinking about all those ways to be flexible and think outside the box for students who stay on a regular or standard diploma path, and also whether or not this might be a student who could really benefit from this alternative diploma path. There are, again, a large group of students not eligible for the alternate assessment, but who still struggle. For example, students who are identified as having a specific learning disability are carved out. They are not eligible for this alternate diploma pathway. And I think, part of the thinking there is, that's not a cognitive intellectual disability. And so these are students for whom workarounds like audiobooks and accommodations and maybe some minor modifications should help them reach regular standard diploma requirements. We'll see how that plays out. I'm just going to kind of wait and see. The IDEA, the special education law, has always allowed alternative coursework and tasks for students to demonstrate in other ways that they meet the requirements. But there's just such a lack of awareness and training and time and flexibility. And so my big advocacy tip here is, even in middle school, if your student is struggling to meet state standards, if they're below basic or at basic in their state testing, if they take the regular testing, if they're really struggling, even if it's because of ADHD or specific learning disability or whatever, get that IEP team to the table and talk about, how to provide support for that student. Because what we don't want to have happen is that we wait too long to intervene until 10th or 11th grade, when the student's so credit deficient or hasn't met requirements that really, again, we've already taken a regular diploma off the table. And this alternative diploma doesn't meet the A through G requirements. If you don't know what that is, that's the UC and California State University requirements to even apply. You have to take a certain amount of math, a certain number of years of English, certain coursework earns with certain grades. So if you put a student, if everybody agrees this is the right pathway, this alternative pathway, just know that you have taken applying straight into a four-year school off the table for them. They could still go to a community college and do their time there and then transfer in, but they will not be UC or CSU eligible. So that's something to just think about, because it can sound like this is a great solution, but not for a student who maybe has some significant cognitive challenges, but wants to go to a four-year college. And now that we're opening up so many more opportunities for students to get a diploma, even with more significant disabilities, the landscape is really changing. We want to make sure we're making a decision based on that individual student situation. So other things just to think about, one size doesn't fit all. The power of IDEA is in the I, the individual eyes. So some families and youth do not want their student on an alternate diploma pathway because they're concerned that it isn't aligned to rigorous graduation standards. It won't meet those A through G requirements. It might limit the student's future opportunities. They might want their student to keep working on the diploma, and that could be a point of disagreement in an IEP meeting. Participating in post-high school transition planning doesn't automatically mean you're giving up on the standard diploma either. So you don't have to take an alternative diploma, but you could say, I want to keep working on academics for the next year or two so that maybe we're still working on the Algebra 1 learning or how to write an essay or whatever and meet graduation requirements, but still stay in the transition team. And the certificate of completion still is an option. There are some students in some situations, where it may be an appropriate decision. These are IEP decisions, and everybody on the IEP team is part of that decision making. So the vast majority of students, this is the big takeaway, should be working toward a standard diploma. But we want to create this option for students who may need to earn a diploma and who have a job and go to college and go to a job training program and have all those options without having to kind of go through life saying, no, I didn't get a high school diploma, but I have a certificate. It's kind of a second class citizenship from the point of view of some students and some people. Okay, so we do a training at DREDF, and I know you guys in the CAC have done this in the past too. I've heard it reported. It was great on transition planning and so on. And I think it's really important to put this decision making about this pathway into the context of IDEA's decision making and transition planning requirements and so on, because I think if you take it out of context, you'll miss some of the important nuance, which is how do we individualize a student's education? When do we start? How soon do we start thinking about the future? And that's why I started this presentation off with the purpose of IDEA, which is to prepare students for future education, employment, and independent or interdependent living, because that's what we want to be doing. We need to get to the table early. We need to make sure that we're really thinking this through. And for any of you who have older students, we all know, and we've all been students, no one I've ever talked to is doing, well, that's not true. There's a few people, but mostly most people have never really followed the exact path they thought they would follow when they were 15 or 16 years old. Yeah, I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to, go to graduate school and be a doctor. I'm going to do this and that. It's always, there's adjustments. And so we need to also make sure as part of transition planning that we're moving back and forth. What if the student is put on this alternate diploma pathway and then makes some huge leaps or finds some interventions that really work for them and decides, no, I'd rather be on a regular diploma path. I want to switch back. We have to be thinking about how we're going to deal with that. And so expecting changes, because it's just part of the process. All right, so I'm going to stop talking because I want to make sure that I can take your questions. But I would beg you to please fill out our evaluation form, because DREDF doesn't get any credit from the U.S. Department of Education, that's who funds us, if we don't gather some basic demographic data and evaluations. So please take a minute, if not now, after the training or tomorrow, but please fill out the evaluation form. I sent it to you guys, Kelly, but I also included it here as a link you might want to drop into the chat or whatever. And that said, anybody have questions? Anybody want to have input? Anything you want to add, expand on?
Hi, I joined in late. I was wondering, would the slide a presentation be available for people who didn't make it tonight?
I'll let Kelly answer that. I believe so. I think it's recorded, isn't it, Kelly?
The presentation is definitely being recorded, and but I don't know, Cheryl, have you given permission for us to post your slide deck as well?
I'm happy if you do that for the CAC. That's fine. Just make sure
great.
that our logo stays on it.
Yeah, you bet. That way the links will be like live links for people to follow up on.
Yeah.
That's great. I did pop the evaluation form into the chat. So if folks could just take a minute to complete that, that would be so helpful. I had a question, Cheryl. When you were talking earlier in the presentation, actually, I wonder, should we come back to the group so we can see everybody?
Sure, I can stop sharing.
Yeah.
Let me just quickly, yeah, there we go.
There we go. I was curious when you were saying, this is possible, but it's really hard. When you were speaking to like, it's really hard, can you illuminate what makes those options hard?
I think so when it comes to the alternative diploma, it's just going to have bumps, right? It's new. Things are going to come up. There's going to be something we didn't anticipate. I think about this, what happens to students who maybe did leave school and then they come back? Can they use this option? There's just some questions that will probably just be left to local education agencies, school districts, and so on, boards of education. The problem is that we need to do a good job of really educating our boards of education so that they even understand how this all works, because I think there is a lack of awareness. And then so that's that group of students who fall into that about 10% of students with a significant cognitive impairment. Mm-hmm. But there's also that other group of students who maybe can't meet the diploma requirements as they're written, wouldn't be eligible for this alternative, but do need the IEP team to really think creatively and kind of sometimes even outside the box about how to help that student. I've seen great things happen. I've seen schools, for example, provide one-to-one math instruction for a year as part of an IEP just to help a student for whom that's going to be the only barrier to the diploma, is that they just need more intensive support to meet that Algebra 1 requirement. And maybe they took it the year before and they didn't do well, they didn't pass it. Do remember that passing in California is a D. I was shocked to realize that with my kid, because it's not for college purposes, a D does not count. But for high school graduation, a D is a passing grade. And so, and the other thing that gets complicated is, there can be an element of subjectivity. It's really hard to identify it, so if a teacher's like, it could be an F plus or a D minus, do you do the D minus just because it's the one class that could provide, so again, I'm not even going to weigh in on whether they should or shouldn't do any one thing, but I think there's just a lot of things that are uncertain. Mm-hmm. And then other ways to meet requirements. So, I know some districts do this. For example, you have to have 2 years of PE to get a high school diploma. That's a minimum requirement. And I can't tell you how many calls we get about kids who are failing PE because they won't dress for PE or they won't cooperate in PE. And these aren't students who would necessarily be eligible for an alternative pathway, but they may need, a different kind of PE plan. And some districts are really flexible about saying, okay, you can sign up for the Y and show us that you logged in at the Y. I know Berkeley has in the past done this. I don't know about right now. But other districts are hardcore. No, you have to pass PE. And so, it is, I think those are some of the challenges. And it's also the place where, when I hear from families, it's where some of the implicit bias stuff starts poking in. How come you did it for this student and not that student? Why were we flexible here, but not there? My student's been labeled, emotionally disturbed and has behavior challenges. And, wow, you send him to a non-public school, you think that's the solution, but he's not really getting any kind of high school preparatory curriculum in that program, but he doesn't have an intellectual disability. So did we just take him off diploma track without really thinking about what we're doing? And so those are all discussions. We're having a very clear, transparent conversation, and sometimes trying something to see if it works, coming back to the table and say, okay, well, that didn't work. Let's try something else, is important. And it's why also whenever I'm training families, I make a point to say, if the team really agrees that this student may need a more segregated placement temporarily, and they are segregated. If you're with typical tiers less peers less. It's a segregated setting. And there are situations where a student needs intensive therapeutic support or other kinds of things, maybe a reduced sensory environment or whatever. But I very rarely see an IEP goal that says a year from now, the student will be in a less restrictive setting. So we always need to think about that as the goal, and again, you come back together in a year and maybe you decide, no, that wasn't an appropriate goal, but it should always be the intention. Because, for example, even a student who has a significant intellectual disability, who's in a general education classroom that's reading something like The Color Purple, they may watch the movie instead. They may read a simplified version of the book, but they're still going to be in that conversation about those incredible issues that arise in that movie and hear the discussion and the input of other students and other perspectives. So we want our students to have that experience if possible. But we also don't want to put them in a situation where, they sort of can't possibly benefit. So just keeping those things in mind is really important.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, on this point, just to take PE as an example, is it accurate that it really is up to the district around how a student meets so it's a state requirement that there's 2 years of PE, but it's up to each district as to how they meet that state requirement?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's so helpful, because sometimes we hear from the IEP team, like, well, that's just not possible. But
and I think often that's such a good point, Kelly, because I think often that's really what they think. And then the parent calls us and we say, well, have you talked about an independent study option? Or have you talked about, doing PE through, a martial arts class or something else? And because that's something the team could decide to do. And the parent will feel very, very betrayed. They never even mentioned it, as if it was like a, active decision to hurt their kid. And usually it's just a lack of real training and understanding that this is something that is possible. And again, that's why I keep saying, thinking outside the box. The goal is, did the student master what we wanted them to master? Did they, in their 3 years of English, which is a California high school requirement, can they write at a certain level? Can they understand text at a certain level? Are there other ways they could show they know it? I once worked in a transition program where a lot of the kids did PowerPoint presentations instead of essays. A lot of them had significant problems with essay writing. But they could really show that they had the content, that they could organize, that they could have citations and all of those things we want a student to know, but they did it through this alternate pathway. So it's not easy, but it's possible.
So Cheryl, you said, jump in if I have something, and I rarely do, but I have something
Yes.
related to this moderate group, and I put it in the chat for people. There is an initiative, and they are looking for statewide input from anybody interested on what is called the Inclusive Access to a Diploma. And it's exactly what, Cheryl, you're saying right now, but it focused on alternative ways to show what you know. So it's got huge implications for general education as well as special education. Mm-hmm. But the original work group that developed the alternative pathway to diploma looked at the 3 groups in Cheryl's slide, acknowledged we're going for those with the significant cognitive impairment first, but now they're rolling and they have a draft proposal and they're seeking input. And they've got a town hall coming up on the 21st of November and a town hall in January, and you can give input on their website. And I put the link to the website in the chat. So I just wanted to reinforce the state is not necessarily really fast, but they're taking it full bore and aligned exactly with what Cheryl is saying.
Yeah. Thank you, Katie, because I actually had heard that might happen, but I guess I haven't been keeping up. I'm really glad to hear that. We'll post it on our website too. Let's get the word out, because, I have to say, and this is in the post-COVID world, so many of the students who are dropping out, or I would say, frankly, being pushed out because their needs aren't met, are students with mental health disabilities. And So for a lot of them, it's like you get flooded with anxiety when you're asked to write because of something related to your, trauma or your mental health or whatever it is. And so many of those students don't end up working for a full diploma, or they leave high school altogether. And I'm so glad to hear the state is thinking about ways to address those needs.
I just reposted it. There was a comment that someone wasn't seeing that link. So let me know if you didn't. I just basically copied and pasted Katie's comment again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
I think this is probably already addressed, but is this alternative diploma, is the current ninth graders eligible for this? The current entering from this fall?
Yes, the 2022-23 class and later of students entering in ninth grade have the option. But now there is, even for students who would, I think it's only the seniors now who would be excluded, if I'm doing my math right? 2022, you were a freshman, 23, you were a sophomore, 24, you're a junior. So there are some juniors and possibly seniors who were kind of excluded from this. And so the state tagged on some additional language in the law just this past June to say, okay, maybe even those other students kind of, you can bring it to the team and have the conversation. So, I think when the IEP process is working correctly, any of this should be open conversation because of the I in IEP. But I think it's also, there's just a lot of misunderstanding out there. And I think we need to do a much better job with our general education teachers and helping them understand and consult with and partner with special education teachers to figure out how to make that curriculum accessible, not just to the 10% of students with significant cognitive disabilities, but also for the other 90% of students with an IEP who just need for people to kind of get it and be more flexible. Years ago, I was talking to a friend who was visiting from France, and we had this conversation, and I was complaining about the state of our education system in the US. And she said, the thing about your system in the US that we envy in Europe is that you allow for the late bloomer. And it really is true. You cannot go to college right out of the chutes. You can go to community college and take 4 or 5 years before you transfer into a 4-year college. My kid is in community college, even though he got into a 4-year college, because he's decided he wants to be an EMT and he's hands-on, and that works better for him. And so we have a lot of ways that we can come back to and think about education and be flexible. So I'm really glad other states, some are more restrictive than California. Others have figured out how to do this, be more flexible a long time ago. I'm glad California is working in the direction of flexibility. I think we're out of time. You're muted, Kelly.
Yeah, we're just there at 7:45, right on the dot. Perfect timing, right. Cheryl.
All right.
I just reposted that evaluation, folks. It's really short. And as Cheryl's noted, the funding for DREDF is contingent on these evaluations being completed. So please do take just the minute to click on that link and complete that.
Yeah, and there's some great resources I included. I made sure there were no dead links because I hate it when that happens at the end of the presentation. And call us at DREDF if you have an individual situation you want to talk through. You're always welcome to do that, and we're happy to help. So, and thank you to the CAC for all the good work you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much for coming back and presenting this to us, Cheryl. And you have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you to everyone for being here with us tonight.